Working Cows Podcast, episode 369. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And this episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature some of the world's leading regenerative ag and adaptive grazing experts on our show. And many of those experts are farmer, rancher instructors from the nonprofit Soil Health Academy. This year, you'll have several opportunities to experience and profit from attending one of their remarkable on-farm schools and workshops. Whether you're interested in learning more about diversifying corn and bean rotations to increase profitability, merging multiple species and marketing, grazing on the high plains and in northern environments, regenerative farming and ranching, or enhancing profits and production in your beef or dairy operation, the Soil Health Academy has a school for you. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself. So visit soilhealthacademy.org to learn more and register. Financial assistance scholarships are available. And I believe right now the plan is for my family and I to be at the Understanding Ag Soil Health Academy, part of my family and I anyways, to be at the Understanding Ag Soil Health Academy some or all of the July 9th through the 11th Soil Health Academy in Fort Pierce, South Dakota, at the Turner Ranches, with the classroom portion taking place in Fort Pierce at the American Inn there. So if you're interested in that, looks like a good one to attend and see what's going on there on the ground at Turner Ranch in South Dakota, in central South Dakota. So July 9th through the 11th, maybe we'll see you there. Coming up today on the Working Cows Podcast, very excited for a conversation with Doctors Stephan Van Vliet and Dr. Alan Williams. I've had multiple people over the recent months recommend talking to Dr. Stephan Van Vliet, and one of the reasons is because of the paradigm-challenging research that he's been doing regarding the role of phytonutrient density in the health of our food and the food that we're consuming, and connecting some of those grass-fed, grass-finished animals to the actual health outcomes in the lives of the people who are consuming them. So really excited for this conversation today with Dr. Williams and Dr. Van Vliet. Doctors, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Clay. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, have had people recommend you numerous times to come on the podcast and speak about some of the research that you've been doing. So what has been capturing your attention and occupying your time recently as far as the things that you're involved in researching?
Yeah, so we have really two pillars to our research at the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State. One involves a lot of food nutritional testing. So we have a particular interest in how does regenerative agriculture, whether it being in cattle or livestock, but also in crops, how does growing or raising foods regeneratively impact the nutritional composition? And we try to go way beyond what appears on the nutrition facts panel. So we use what is called a metabolomics approach. It's looking at a large number of metabolites. So these are things that go beyond just protein and fat and a handful of vitamins and minerals. And we're seeing how this is impacted through growing practices. And then what we oftentimes do also is we run randomized controlled clinical trials in humans where we subsequently feed these foods to humans to see, does this have an appreciable effect on their health? Sure.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating research, and really appreciate the work that you've been doing. Just a little bit more on your background. Is kinesiology often what comes as a logical outworking of masters in exercise and nutrition science? Does that often follow? Is that the course that people often follow?
No, I don't think so. But I must admit that even though my degree is in kinesiology, I don't know a thing about gait or walking or things such as that, right? Like traditional kinesiology. So a little bit about the background is that during my degree in kinesiology, the research that we were doing at the time was actually doing a lot of protein metabolism work. So looking at muscle metabolism in response to whole foods. So I was really doing work that was at least related to it. So it's always funny because people think I have a kinesiology degree and acts like, oh, you think my running stride is good, and I'm like, I don't know a thing about that. So. But yeah, so the background is and why we kind of got into these things is that we were studying muscle metabolism in humans, right? And muscle metabolism or meat metabolism, right? It's actually quite analogous. And some of the interesting findings is that we made is that when an example I like to give is, for instance, when we study athletes in the lab by taking a muscle biopsy from them and we look at their mitochondrial health, their glucose health, their just metabolism and health in general. The muscle actually tells you a lot about that. If you apply sort of those methods on a piece of meat, it's surprising how strikingly similar a cow is. It's just another mammal. And if a cow is outside, grazing, engaging in plenty of physical activity, handled in a low stress environment, able to engage in innate behavior, it shows kind of this phenotype of this endurance trained athlete. And when cows are more restricted in their ability to engage in innate behavior or consume a very diverse diet, they start to kind of reflect a what we would call a sort of metabolic derangement a little bit, or less healthy phenotype, similar to what you see in a human that may be a couch potato or something like that.
So what you're saying, if I can say it just bluntly, is that in general, or it tends to be that animals that are grass-fed, grass-finished are going to be producing more nutrient-dense and metabolically healthy meat than feedlot animals. Can I be that blunt?
If you want to paint with broad strokes, yeah. Although one thing that we found, though, is that there's sort of a 10x variation amongst grass-fed. So even more so than in feedlot finish. So in grass-fed isn't grass-fed either. If animals are on very biodiverse pastures in general, and they don't overgraze those pastures, they definitely look healthier than sort of a continuous grazing, where in June the grass is a few inches tall and actually overgrazed. So that's also where you kind of start limiting the health of the animal. So, and in the feedlot side of things, to be 100% transparent, feedlot isn't feedlot either. We actually found some samples. So the interesting part is that the best grass-fed samples that we test are definitely what you would consider healthier or more nutrient dense than the best feedlot samples. But the best feedlot samples are still better than the worst grass-fed samples.
Yeah, right. And I think that even I've heard of, work, you mentioned low stress stockmanship. I've heard of work by Bud Williams way back in the day, where he would exercise cattle in the feedlot and they would be, produce better results, gain better, and those kinds of things. So I think even down to that low stress handling part of it becomes a big part of this as well. And does this kind of represent a paradigm shift in the protein sector and in the way that we're viewing what it means to produce protein?
I certainly think that, it's a niche still, I would say, pasture finished animals, but it is certainly growing. That is clear. If you look at sort of the statistics, the grass-fed beef market has been doubling over the last few years, and there's certainly a further increased interest in this. Yeah, so it's definitely growing, but it's still the majority of cattle finished in the U.S. is dominant in the feedlot system.
Alan, I'd turn to you on this. And, he mentions we're not overgrazing our pastures. We're moving them regularly. They're on a diverse mix, of plant options available to them. That sounds a lot like what Understanding Eg's been saying for quite some time now, right? As far as the 6, the 3, and the 4, and some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that has really resonated with me relative to Stephan's research, both in the I've looked at the data from the beef, from the bison, and from the dairy that Stephan and his team have done, and knowing the farms that have been participatory and looking at the data, there's a handful of things that really stand out. One is, yes, are there variations between, grass-fed, grass-finished farms? Absolutely. Just like if we measure enough feedlots, there's going to be variation in them as well because they have different finishing rations. That being said, what is clearly standing out is that the farms and ranches in the data set that have managed the best in terms of adhering to the regenerative principles and practices are absolutely heads and shoulders above the others in their phytonutrient data results. And there's two keys there that we have put together. So we've combined, what we know, our data, with Stephan's data. And there's two very strong correlations that are exposing themselves here. One is that the more biologically rich and active the soil is, the more phytonutrient rich that end product is going to be, the beef, the bison, or the dairy. And the second is, and Stephan mentioned this just a moment ago, the more diverse the pastures are, okay, then the more phytonutrient rich that end product is going to be. So those two things seem to be holding true regardless of the protein and regardless of the farm or the ranch. And that is paradigm shifting, in my opinion, because it's very much antagonistic to the way that we've been taught to manage, over the last several decades. And in all fairness, the way that I taught when I was in academia, so I was guilty of that as well. So to me, that validates regenerative principles and practices. It validates adaptive grazing. And it says very strongly that if we can continue to, improve our regenerative practices and our adaptive grazing, we should see ongoing and incremental increases in the phytonutrient profiles of this end product. Now, the other thing that really struck me, Clay, and I'm going to ask Stephan to respond to this as well, but in my involvement with this research, never before have I ever seen nutritional research that literally started with the soil.
Yeah.
So, in helping Stephan and his team collect data on some of this, I mean, literally, we were out there collecting soil samples every time, then observing what the animals were eating and collecting those plants and the parts of those plants that the animals were eating, then following them around and collecting fresh fecal matter to analyze, and then, of course, the end product. That's phenomenal. And Stephan, I would like to ask for you to respond to that relative to the overall body of nutritional research.
Yeah, well, I think historically, and this is still happening in research, right? Like there's now a more increase in systems research where nutrition scientists like myself work together with ecologists, work with farmers, with soil biologists to kind of put all of that together. I noticed always one thing, and prior to this, I was at medical schools, and we would study diseases that are largely rooted in dietary origin, and we still do, but we don't actually never connect with the people that produce our food, the farmers. And it seems prudent that that's the way to start, right? So So there has been a little bit more of a push from that, also from federal funding, especially through SARE, which the project was supported through. They like this systems approach, like this collaborative nature, because we're all working on the same project, but we're working in sort of isolated factions. So, but yeah, this is one of the first projects, or first project to my knowledge, that really started with the soil. And yeah, one thing what we're seeing, and I remember, Alan, we were also going to nearby cornfields, right, and collecting corn, and we ran that soil data, and it was clear that if you in the same ecosystem manage it as a pasture and manage it as croplands for feed crops, this was obviously a model. This was going into the commodity market, but it was a model for feed crops, and this work was actually published last year. Alan Franz Lubers was the first author on this, and what clear thing that he found, or found the work that we did, was in the same ecoregion, managing this field as a pasture or growing feed crops and then put through animals in a feedlot, you're reducing soil health, is the short now, or you're improving soil health by managing as a pasture. And this was very clear from that data set. And then obviously, if you take that then further, we studied forages and the total mixed ration as well. The total mixed ration contained a lot of the feed crops that would be grown in conventional ways, typically monocultures, heavy agriculture inputs. We see that the phytonutrient composition is 5-10 times higher in the forages versus the TMR, and then you go to the animal, and then it's again higher in the animal. So you see this clear sort of going from healthier soils to healthier forage to healthier animals. And now the next gap that we're trying to close is, does this also lead to healthier humans? And it probably, if you ask this or tell anyone on the street, this couldn't come as a surprise, right? It's kind of like common knowledge. But in order to influence policy, you'll have to study these things and see if they're true or not.
Yeah, and I think that's the next question that I have is, why does increasing phytonutrients matter? Why does this matter?
Well, we have solved diseases back in the past, we had lots of nutrient deficiencies, and we also had infectious diseases. Now, we have done a great job in solving these, but at current times, we have metabolic diseases, chronic metabolic diseases. Phytonutrients are generally considered antioxidants. So they are anti-inflammatory, antioxidants. They can improve the health of our liver. They can even impact insulin signaling. They can impact cancer cells. And these are the diseases that we suffer from in modern times. So if we, at least that's the hypothesis, and then epidemiological studies would suggest that this is the case, if you have higher amounts of these phytochemical antioxidants in your diet, you could lower your risk of metabolic disease. And this is really the challenge that we have now. And I mean, it's not just that we're not eating grass-fed beef or anything. Of course, it's like the overall diet, right? Like the major elephant in the room is high consumption of ultra-processed foods and the standard American diet, which is very low in these phytochemicals. And it would be very low in essential vitamins and minerals as well, because we've been fortifying foods with them for a long time now, right? We had B vitamins, we had zinc, we had iron, two things such as flour or white rice. But we're not getting this phytochemical richness in our diet that we would otherwise get when animals are raised regeneratively, or if crops are also grown regeneratively. We see higher antioxidant values there too. We've tested rice, we've tested oats, tested wheats, and we see this there as well. When these are grown in polycultures, in healthier soils, phytochemicals increase. So I believe that this is a way that we can improve diet quality and lower our risk of metabolic disease, which is arguably the biggest health challenge of our lifetime.
Yeah, I think I've heard it said that adding zinc and niacin to flour and rice and those things is like spray tan nutrients, like it's as real as a spray tan is a real tan, and it doesn't last, and it's not really that that impactful in the grand scheme of things. And I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or would like to say anything about that. If not, I can move on to another question.
No, well, it's very important to notice that this reductionist approach, right, to nutrition, or just like, I mean, we do it in science too, right? It's like the systems are so complex, and do we fully understand how these things work? No. I mean, does beef contain 50,000 compounds, which is estimated? Probably true. How do they all work in regards to our health? We're not sure, right? But a very good example of that is that there's two major examples. The first example is vitamin D. Vitamin D is not that high in foods, but if you eat an egg with vitamin D, you'll get higher levels in your blood that you would expect based on simply the amount. So if you give an equivalent amount as a supplement, it wouldn't rise as far. And the same thing goes, for instance, for grass-fed beef. People always bring forward the argument and say, it contains minuscule amounts of omega-3s. It's not important. But actually, when you feed it to people, you see that there are blood omega-3 rises far more than what you expect based on the amount that's in there. So this illustrates, I think, the complexity of foods, which come with a bunch of cofactors that we don't fully understand, but it does seem to have almost sort of a snowball effect or an additive effect. It improves things more than you would expect by simply looking at an Excel spreadsheet. And the same thing is true, for instance. Yes, you can use a Band-Aid approach of fortifying with zinc and iron and copper, but these things all work together, and it's very likely that there's other hundreds of compounds that interact within the whole food matrix that actually improve this. Final part of this that I want to highlight is that why is zinc or iron, besides, for instance, being difference between heme iron being in animal source foods and non-heme in plants, but you typically see that even if you eat animal source foods, that the non-heme iron from plants is also improved. And this is what we call the meat factor. These are unidentified factors in meat that even seem to improve the iron uptake from plants. We don't know what it is, we just know it works.
Yeah, I would just add to what Stephan is saying for our listeners that Mark Schatzker has a very, very good book. His latest book is called The End of Craving. And he covers a lot of these topics that you and Stephan were just talking about relative to just this, sort of, one-on-one supplementation type deal into our foods, the enriched flours and, things like that, and how those are creating more health problems rather than solving health problems. So I really encourage people, if they haven't, to check out Mark Schatzker's book, The End of Craving, to gain some more insight into that.
Antioxidants would seem to indicate, the benefits of antioxidants would seem to indicate to me that oxidation is a problem. Can you talk to me a little bit about that and what that is all about, why that is?
Yeah, it reduces what is called oxidative stress, and oxidative stress can come from a variety of things. I mean, it could be our modern lifestyles. It's like a sleep induces oxidative stress, environmental toxins, but also certainly how would you say it? Like maybe ultra processed foods seem to be able to garner more inflammation. But oxidative stress also it's a natural part of our bodies. It needs to happen. We need to challenge our bodies a little bit to adapt. But when this oxidative stress or inflammation becomes chronic, and this is what we're suffering from, sort of as a Western society, this is a very important underlying factor for chronic metabolic disease. So if we're able to reduce our oxidative stress by consuming more antioxidants, we should be able to lower our risk of things such as diabetes and heart disease and cancer. Obviously this is fully proving this in humans is always very challenging. But to give you an example, if you put certain phytochemicals on a cancer cell line, the cancer doesn't grow as fast, or it has reduced growth, or it has what we call anti-tumor properties. If we get a broad amount of these in our diet in 30 years, if we do so in 30 years, we should in theory, reduce our rates of cancer, right? And that obviously we cannot measure in a randomized controlled trial, so we have to infer. But what we can measure in randomized controlled trials are biomarkers, and we see, for instance, that people's health improve, their biomarkers improve. So may have less inflammation, their triglycerides, their fat in their blood may drop, and they just start showing an overall healthier metabolic phenotype.
And this is another one of those things that I heard maybe in a dark corner of the internet somewhere. So if you want to dispel this myth, that's fine. But I recently heard somebody say that there is a suggestion that Alzheimer's is basically just type 3 diabetes. It's a natural outgrowth of these metabolic issues. It isn't totally unpredictable. It is something that we could probably influence with diet. Is that reasonable from what you're seeing in research?
Yeah, it is reasonable. I mean, certainly it's not normal to develop Alzheimer's or have large cognitive impairments as you age. That is not a normal scenario. Certainly, yes, there is relatively strong evidence to suggest that having chronically elevated glucose levels or having prediabetes or diabetes, that this is an important risk factor for Alzheimer's. Yep. Especially since the brain relies heavily on glucose.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. We've been fortunate to feature a number of Understanding Ag's regenerative farming and ranching experts on the podcast over the years. In that time, Understanding Ag's reputation for helping producers understand and successfully and profitably apply money-saving regenerative principles and practices has only grown. And there are two primary reasons for that. First, Understanding Ag's consultants are farmers and ranchers who've been there, done that on their own regenerative farms. And second, Understanding Ag's consultants aren't in the business to sell you costly inputs. They get no commissions and you get no pressure. Just profit-building solutions for your operation. Learn more at understandingag.com and discover the hope in healthy soil. That's www.understandingag.com. One thing that both of you have touched on in the course of this conversation is the difference between pasture finishing and grass finishing. And I think that the diversity becomes the real key there, as I understand it. And maybe there's more going on there, but I think we should maybe flesh that out a little bit more. Because if all we're doing is trying to meet a market demand with a grass-finished animal, then I think we could probably cut some corners and miss out on some of the benefits of an actual pasture-finished animal where there's more diversity present. So, feel free to jump in and add to that as you see fit.
Well, I've been involved in grass-fed since the late 1990s. So quite some time now. Actually, it's hard to believe it's been that long. But and so I even wrote the original set of protocols that has since been copied by many different branded programs in some form or fashion. But the one thing that we have clearly noted over the past 25 plus years of doing grass-fed is that, yes, the health of the soil and the diversity of that finishing diet absolutely matters. So grass-fed is not grass-fed is not grass-fed. If we are finishing them on a monoculture diet, say wheat pasture or ryegrass pasture or whatever, you are not going to have the same phytonutrient profile and fatty acid profile that you're going to have in those that are eating a much more diverse diet. So managing regeneratively absolutely matters here. So I can do grass-fed and grass-finished without implementing adaptive grazing or regenerative practices. But if I do, I'm not going to have the same product relative to that phytonutrient density that I will compared to, the grass-fed beef from those that are managing really regeneratively and managing for these highly diverse pastures. And the other thing that we have found is that the amount of forbs that are growing in these pastures really matters. And the fact that those animals are consuming these forbs. And unfortunately, Clay, and this, having been in the industry as long as you have, is that what we're often taught about forbs, those are weeds and we need to get rid of them. We need to get them out of our pastures. But what we have discovered, and what Stephan's data is clearly, showing, is that the more forbs we have and the more that these animals are eating, the richer this phytonutrient profile is. And he says that they're loaded with antioxidants and anti-inflammatories. And look, that's not just important for us. It's important for the animals. So the animals eating that phytonutrient-rich diet are also far healthier and perform a lot better.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, Clay, and Alan, is an excellent point. And it made me think, like, strong evidence that we have for that is that we've also tested deer sample and lamb in our lab too. And, not to talk down beef or anything, but the deer is, sort of the deer is the highest in phytochemicals, then lamb is intermediate, and beef is the lowest. These are painting with broad strokes again, right? Because you can obviously train animals, or animals can learn how to eat these forbs, but what is causing 5 times higher phytochemicals in deer? Well, it is because of their grazing behavior. They consume more forbs and shrubs, and the same with sheep as well. And it's like, you can see this on the pasture, right? These colorful flowers that sometimes we consider weeds, indeed, right? And I look at this and I see like purple colors on it, yellow colors on it, and I'm thinking like phytochemicals, right? But sometimes, indeed, I have a discussion with a rancher, and he says, "I need to get rid of this. This is a weed," and I'm like, "Well, no, this is like prime." One man's weed is another goat's prime meal, right? And but this is also like a bigger picture thing, and I know it's not always that easy, right? It's like, not. I would say, and this is maybe an interesting thing to also to discuss, is sort of the multi-species grazing. I don't believe there's a really strong ecological or nutritional reasons not to do it, but the practical reasons are obviously, I can certainly appreciate that. But my point being is that even if a cattle may avoid some of these, other animals might be very much able to capitalize on these, and especially in the sort of the European system, like the French and Italian literatures is really strong on that even the multi-species grazing. We have some nice work also from the 90s out west, where it was quite common to run sheep and cattle together. And I've noticed some farmers are starting to do it again because if you have a bunch of weeds that are taken over, but because the cattle avoid it, but then other animals, by strategically grazing them, improve it, and you may produce more food per acre, and you get more phytochemical richness. And then also sort of Dr. Provenza, an important mentor of mine, also always highlights is that even cattle can be trained for that. And I remember this visibly, Alan, when we were at BDA, right? Is that I think it was the piney wood, the cattle, they were, as the other cattle were just eating the grass, those were nibbling on the trees. And when I saw that, I was like, okay, these animals, they have this innate knowledge to know that these green leaves on these trees are actually packed with phytochemicals. It's probably the kale equivalent of what is in our diet.
Yeah, and I think that this is another argument for diversity, right? Since we and animals share a common designer, we all need diversity in our diet. So maybe you should eat some venison, but it's pretty lean. So maybe eat it for breakfast with a nice pasture-raised egg, or a few eggs, and get some of that good healthy fat in your diet as well. So I think that there's an argument there for the diversity as well. So continue just to see these things line up, right? And diversity makes its way into all three of the 6, the 3, and the 4. And I think it again goes back to that. What are we accomplishing with this diversity? But more phytochemical richness, phytonutrient richness in the meat that we're producing. And so pretty exciting stuff there. Very much appreciate that. And I think that this goes a long ways to, meat, milk, and eggs have been demonized over the last 20, 30 years probably. They were the smallest portion other than sugar of the food pyramid when I was growing up as a kid. And, so now we're getting back to seeing maybe that wasn't all there was to it. Maybe there's more to this than that. So would you want to talk a little bit to that, about this kind of shift that we're seeing towards maybe including more of these things in the diet?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, certainly, and there's also plenty of research on that, is that eating meat, milk, and eggs as part of a standard American diet is not the same as part of a Mediterranean diet or a mind diet or a bold diet or a paleo diet or a traditional American diet or a traditional Japanese diet or however label you want to put on this. What do all these diets have in common? They're whole foods based.
Mhm.
And in that case, you do see improvements in health. And from at least the argument that I would put forward is that meat, milk, and eggs are completely compatible with good health when consumed as part of a high quality diet, for sure. And we can go a little bit into the mechanisms of that, because there's definitely also a complementary nature of plant and animal source foods. Like there's some work in vitro digestion models, is that if you would, and just to simulate human digestion, if you would eat your beef with your steak with a salad, you actually see some of what we consider quote unquote harmful compounds being greatly reduced, because you're consuming this with certain plant foods that may offset that. Sort of antagonistic to that is that if you eat beef and beans in your chili, you actually improve the nutrient uptake from those beans. So it's like sort of the complementary nature. But yes, I mean, if you are eating beef as part of in fast food outlets with buns and fries and 64-ounce Coke, then yes, this is problematic. And then we can argue, is it the beef or is it not the beef? But unfortunately, this is how the majority of people, unfortunately, consume red meat. And I think, therefore, in part of that, it has been, what you would call, quote unquote, demonized.
Yeah, and not to offend the state that downloads the podcast the most, but did you hear that Texas chili should have beans in it? Just wanted to say that.
Does it also have beef in it still or not?
Yeah, it does have beef in it. In what they call chili in Texas, I think we call a sloppy Joe here in South Dakota. But that's just a little interstate food squabble.
They may be onto something, actually, I would say. So that's the way to do it.
Right.
Eat your beans with some beef, and you get maybe the best of both worlds.
Exactly. Yep. It's always been funny to me that the standard American diet, the acronym spells SAD. It's a SAD diet, and so I think that there's definitely some things there. And I've had that suspicion for a few years now that the issue isn't the meat, milk, and eggs. It's what we're eating with them. It's the pancakes and syrup. It's the bun and the fries and the Coke. It's all of those things, and the way that those things are produced. Is there a healthy way to? Is there a healthy balance of eating, including regeneratively raised potatoes from Brendan Rocky in Colorado and other things, breads that are raised from regeneratively raised, grains and things like that. Yeah, I think you could probably include them in balance with other things. And what you've mentioned a couple of times here that's interesting to me, and I'd like to hear from both of you on this, is that a lot of these things end up being not a 1 + 1 = 2 thing. It's a 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 thing, where they're playing a role together that they can't accomplish alone. Is that borne out by some research as well?
Yeah, this is for sure the case. I mean, certainly it's early innings on the human nutrition research, so I have to be a little bit careful in the statements that I make on that. So what I feel very comfortable stating is that foods produced regeneratively look healthier on paper, and animals produced regeneratively look healthier on paper. But we do have a few years ahead of us where we now feed these things to people in randomized controlled clinical trials. And one thing I would love to also see, and I know even, like randomized controlled trials have limitations, like we feed people for 3 months and no one's going to develop heart disease in our study. And if they do, I got a whole lot of explaining to do to the IRB. But at the same time, epidemiological studies, like these large cohort studies, they never ask people about the quality of the beef. Like, was this grass-fed? Was this pasture-raised? And of course, people will bring up the argument to say, well, Stephan, people that eat grass-fed beef, they probably also smoke less, they drink less, they have higher socioeconomic status, they're probably more educated, they have maybe, do 100 other things that are beneficial for their health. But I would still love to see studies like that being done, because it may be, and this will be my hypothesis, that beef is not even associated with heart disease and cancer and diabetes anymore. That will be my hypothesis. And then you can argue, well, it wasn't then the beef to begin with, but okay, we need multiple lines of evidence to point towards that same thing. So and I think those are the types of studies that need to be done. It's randomized controlled trials, which is something we're working on. I'm not an epidemiologist, but I would also love to see folks in the epidemiological space doing large 20, 30,000 cohort studies that ask people, instead of like how many servings of red meat did you consume over the last 3 months, but also asking, was any of that meat grass-fed, organic, or pasture-raised? And then my guess would be is that you start to see differences there too, which will help inform policy and really start to take into consideration the quality of meat and milk and eggs as well, that this may play a role.
Alan, anything on that 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 conversation in the way that we eat?
So first of all, what I would say is, and we have quite a bit of data on this now, what we see from a soil biological standpoint in response is that once you get to a certain point, you change from linear progress to exponential. So again, 1 + 1 no longer equals 2, it equals 8, 10, 12. And we absolutely see that in the soil, in response to regenerative principles and practices. And we have quite a bit of data that substantiates that now, that point where you begin to see that exponential return. Now, what I will say also is that, in our animals, our livestock that are eating these phytonutrient-rich diets, they are absolutely far healthier and have greater longevity than the animals that are eating a TMR, or a low diversity diet. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts about that anymore. We see that over and over and over again. And so it only makes sense. I mean, again, as Stephan said earlier, they're mammals, we're mammals. If they respond that way to a more phytonutrient-rich diet, why in the world would we not? It just wouldn't make sense that we would respond differently than they would. So it almost has to follow through. But as Stephan says, it's just much more difficult to measure and monitor in humans because we have so many other auxiliary behaviors going on with this. But the other thing that I would say, and the work of our close friend and colleague, Dr. Fred Provenza, his 40 plus years of work have clearly shown that with a more phytonutrient rich diet, you see profound benefits, and that these animals inherently know, given the option, and if they have the dietary choices, they are going to choose. And if these choices are side by side, they're going to choose the phytonutrient rich diet every time. And what I have noticed, and many others of us now that are regenerative farmers and ranchers, in eating, because we eat our own foods most of the time. When I go on the road, when Gabe Brown goes on the road, and others of us, and we have to eat restaurant food or whatever, literally within 5 to 15 minutes, our bodies are telling us, and I actually almost screaming at us, why did you eat that crap? So our bodies are telling us the difference pretty quickly. And Fred says the bodies of these animals are telling them that very quickly as well.
Yeah, I think an excellent example would be is that, coming back to your excellent point, Alan, that's just another mammal, right? And this could be the name of when Charles Darwin wrote his book, right? The Origin of Species. His entire point is animals or non-human animals are just another mammal. So he was drawing a lot of these parallels in evolution, but this still holds true today. It's like, but let's say this, take an example. If we walk into a buffet and we can select from 50 different foods, we are better able to nourish ourselves than we sit down and we get our plate shoved in front of us 3 times a day with a very simple mixed ration, you could argue, right? Like if we get like the same couple of foods 3 times a day shoved in front of us, we're not going to be, it would stand to reason that if you give people this example, they say, yeah, of course, we're going to be healthier if we can select from 50 different foods. Well, a cow or a goat or a bison is not in any way different.
Yeah, and then it goes to, and the connection that still needs to be made, if I understand what you said earlier correctly, is that leap from, if you're eating animals that have that salad bar beef or that buffet approach to what they're eating, then you're going to be healthier as well. Is that connection isn't quite fully made yet? Did I understand you correctly?
That is right. So the strongest evidence on this now from over sort of the last decade is that if you eat meat from such animals, you see increases in omega-3s in your blood. And that should, over time, lower your risk of metabolic disease. And there have been some studies that look at inflammatory markers that also find that inflammation is down a little bit. What we don't know yet, and this is sort of where our mind is at, okay, we see these phytochemicals, and this was something we also had to learn, and so we're a few years in now and further ahead. So is that actually the phytochemicals that are in the plants, they get transformed within the animal to a different compound, what we now call maybe a mammalian phenolic metabolite. So the benzoic acid, which is a phenolic in the plant, all of a sudden becomes 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid, or some other compound that is pretty hard to measure. So this is one thing that we're also learning. But my point being is that we get it in a mammalian form already, with the animal transforming it. So is there a benefit for the animal pre-processing some of these compounds for us? And I think this is sort of the deeper scientific question is that, does that then help raise the levels of this in our blood by getting these pre-processed compounds? And another important thing is that animals can obviously take forages you and I cannot consume, and can transform these phytochemicals that we would otherwise not have access to into forms that are potentially more usable by us. But that question has not been answered yet. So we would need to have further sort of essentially run similar metabolomics approaches on human blood as we do on the milk and the meat of animals.
Yeah, very good. And you've mentioned a few times, these are some of the things that would be my hypothesis, and I appreciate that. What are some of the hypotheses that you think need to be tested in that regard? What are some things that, when we're done with this study, this is the next thing we need to look at? These are the questions created by answering this question, right?
Yeah, I mean, right now the comparison is grass-fed versus grain-fed. So sort of the best grass-fed meat versus the probably worst grain-fed meat is that we're kind of studying. We're going to start we actually fed PDA meat in a short-term trial, which we're now working on the metabolomics this summer. So we'll probably have results from that in about 12 weeks or so. But this will be an initial trial. Then I think, depending on the differences that we see, can we then start teasing out polyculture versus monotonous diet amongst grass-fed, right? Because we see on paper that there's clear differences, but we don't know if this is the case in humans. So then we'll be teasing out more of those details. Then also another thing that is that what if you eat all your meat, milk, and eggs from regenerative systems, right? Because we're also not just consuming beef, right? We in a sort of a real world scenario, people consume a bunch of different animal source foods. So that's another thing to look at. Then also the dose becomes another question. So yeah, we can probably draw up the next decade of research here on what needs to happen. But those are things that we need to hash out. And I think initial big question that we have, now that we understand these things a little bit better, is that, do these mammalian metabolites that we get already pre-processed to us, is this beneficial for us? So, because we know that if we, for instance, get heme iron, that this is so getting it through an animal source foods is better than getting it through our plant source foods. And I don't want to make the case that we shouldn't be eating fruits and vegetables. I think we should be eating that, because a carrot is a whole lot better source of beta carotene than grass-fed beef is, even though you find beta carotene in beef. But my point being is that these initial mammalian metabolites, can they further increase the bioavailability of us? And I think that's an initial very important question that we need to answer. And I think that would also help us understand, as farmers start moving in towards regenerative practices. Because as Alan said, I think the animal health side, I'm 100% in agreement of that too. It's just that I think this is very clear. The soil health piece of having biodiversity also, but to really make that bridge towards human health, I think is the very next important step.
I want to give Alan a chance to ask you a question here, Stephan, before we point towards wrapping up. So go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, so, Stephan, one of the things that I found very unique as well, beyond what we were measuring, or the things that were being collected for y'all to analyze and measure, again, the soil, the plants, fecal matter, the end product, all of that. But the other thing that I noted as a former university researcher myself was the fact that you and the actual leading researchers, the PIs, were the ones in the field collecting the data, and that doesn't happen often anymore in research, with the actual PIs being out there. And the other thing I noted was the fact that, and again, this doesn't happen very much anymore with a lot of PIs. And when I say PI, I'm talking about principal investigator, for those in the audience that may not know that jargon. But is that I noted Stephan, Franz Lubers, everybody out there was also making other observations beyond just the data collection. So Stephan, I wanted to ask you to just talk a little bit about that and about how that is so unique in today's scientific community.
Yeah, no, that's really kind words, Alan. I think you just made me blush a little bit. But no, I think, here's the thing, is that, like, I learned so much from farmers by just being out in the field, talking to them, observing them, and this makes me realize what we need to study. And I think one of the risks as a PI, as a principal investigator, not a private investigator, is that you become disconnected from the work that you're doing, right? Like, if I sit in my office all the time, it becomes this ivory tower thinking. And so being out in the field and observing these things just helps trying to understand this, because a lot of this, I always jokingly say, is that a lot of work that we do is just verifying common sense amongst farmers, what farmers already know. And I learned so much from that. So I often like to go do field work, go to ranches, and learn from farmers, and learn from folks such as Alan, that have this wealth of practical experience. And then we say that, okay, let's see if we can test this and see if we can put some sort of substantiate these empirical observations. And 99% of the time this is true. So I think that's so important for us, because there becomes this real risk that, and this is oftentimes something I grapple with as well. I stand out in a ranch, I see incredible biodiversity, right? See animals grazing, and I think to myself, I cannot help but think that this is probably not destroying the earth. If I go back into my office and read 100 papers, within a few days, I can convince myself again that this is the worst thing that we're doing. That what I just saw, these animals out on pasture, is the worst thing for the environment. But it's not, of course. But if I read a bunch of papers on greenhouse gas emissions, then you can convince yourself that this animal out on pasture is really bad for the environment. And I think, and this is always like what's so mind-boggling to me when I sometimes read reports and influential scientific papers. I sometimes think, like, you should really get out of your office and step onto a ranch. And I think you will have a real, like, sort of identity crisis right away, where you're like, I didn't really gather this from my Excel spreadsheet or my modeling program. And this is also one of the challenges, is like capturing this diversity. Yeah, we see birds, we see wildlife habitat, we see animals being healthier, but then going back and trying to model that is incredibly hard. So I understand the nuance, but I do think it's really important also for academics in general that work in the field of red meat and environmental impacts of ruminant agriculture to really be closely connected to practitioners such as you guys, so that we can help solve this issue together, and that you don't, I mean, we have made decisions based on reductionistic approaches, and then you take this very complex issue, right, of ruminant agriculture, and then we dumb that down to greenhouse gas emissions, and then you come to the conclusion that stuffing an animal inside a feedlot is better because of less emissions. But that misses a whole lot of nuances, and I think that we have to be really careful that we don't make decisions in a hasting manner, or that are not based on or that do not take into account that complexity, even if we don't understand the complexity.
Yeah, I think that means that your advice for researchers is to touch grass. Is that right?
That's right. For researchers to touch grass, and for researchers that are heavily involved in the space on nutritional and environmental impacts, to really, even call up your local rancher and say, like, hey, can I visit and learn about some of the practices that you're doing, given my concern about the environmental impacts of this.
Right. Yeah. How long did it take for the smog to disappear during the COVID shutdowns in places like LA and other places, and never seen a whiff of smog here in Mud Butte, South Dakota, oddly enough. But, that's just my reductionistic conclusion, I guess, So appreciate your time today. I do want to make this practical if we can. And, Alan mentioned it earlier. We talked to Christine Root last time that we had the team at Understanding Ag on at Regenified. And I want to, ranchers are eaters too, right? So how does this research help us make more informed decisions as eaters? I want to start there as we point towards wrapping up.
It tells us that there is a difference, first and foremost. And, beef is not beef, milk is not milk, eggs are not eggs. Okay. There is a difference. So the way we manage our farms and ranches absolutely does matter, because we're not producing generic food. There really is no such thing as generic food. And so what we do matters to us and our own families that are on those farms and ranches, and how we eat in our, lifetime health. And then, of course, because we are the food producers for, lots of other people, then obviously this has very profound compounding and cascading effects, either positive or negative. So if we are producing highly phytonutrient dense foods, then we're having a profoundly positive compounding effect on the consumer population that is consuming those foods. So to me, as a farmer and rancher, this matters a lot. And as a direct marketer of the foods that we produce off our farm, what I can tell you is that when I share with our customers this data, that Stephan has been putting together, it resonates with them right away. I mean, they don't even have to think twice about it. When they hear us say and show them that there's more phytonutrient richness here, their very first reaction is, I want this food.
I also think the important thing to note is that the food just tastes better, because there's phytochemicals. We didn't touch on it. We call them antioxidants, but actually these are flavor compounds. If you eat a more phytochemically rich strawberry, it has the deep strawberry flavor that you may not otherwise get in the sort of watered down, quote unquote, conventional strawberries, right? So these are things that you taste too. So your food just starts to taste better. And I think, therefore, sometimes people complain. And again, talking about like another thing that we study, children that don't like fruits and vegetables. Yeah, I don't blame them, because it tastes like cardboard, right? Like your average carrot. But then if you have a carrot that is grown in really well soil, it has like this deep flavor that maybe we can get our kids to appreciate fruits and vegetables more as well. So I think it also actually helps us appreciate whole foods more, and maybe can help us move away from this standard American diet that has these fake flavors that do, maybe act on our sensory properties, but obviously don't provide us the nourishment.
Sure. And the last question I have here is also to make this practical for this audience. How does this become a guide for ranchers? And Alan, I think you touched on this. You can add to it if you want. But how does this conversation that we had here today become a guide for ranchers, and how do they respond to it, just from producers of food from that perspective?
Well, certainly, again, because of the correlations that I talked about early on that we are clearly seeing, that if we are managing for healthier, more biologically rich soils, and we are managing for more diversity in our pastures and on our rangeland and all of that, then, not only are we going to see positive impacts in terms of productivity and resilience and water infiltration and biodiversity and all of those things, but we're going to see positive impacts, as I mentioned earlier, in the health of our livestock, and obviously the positive impacts in our lifetime health as well. So, for a farmer or rancher, really, that's what I need to know. Does the way that I manage truly make a difference in all of these things? And if it does, then I'm going to do it that way because it matters. And it matters not just to me, but it matters to everybody that what I do touches.
Anything to add there, Stephan?
No, I think Alan is spot on. It's also sort of like having, local stewardship and things such as that can help with the uptake of this, right? Like if it happens in your backyard, you're going to be more inclined to do it. And if you're even in urban environments, are able to visit a farm from time to time, and maybe volunteer, and then the farm might give you some free eggs, if you help with some things. But it also just like for the mindset, you'll probably feel better anyway. Like and then it will feel like, oh, we're really working on this in our local environment, and as opposed to like something that feels far away from us. So I think that's another piece.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, even if you're not going to go through the effort of direct marketing your meat, because honestly that business isn't for everybody, but even if you're not going to do that, at least be ready when the market develops so that you can feed that with regeneratively raised meat, that you can verify how it's been raised and all those things. So I think that's it's still worthwhile even if you're not going to capitalize on the increased value of that meat. So very much appreciate your time today, gentlemen. Anything else that you'd like to add or say as we wrap up?
Well, Clay, I think one thing that I want to say, and another shout out to Stephan here, is that I promise you, he is not a soft academic, okay? Because, anybody that comes out to the heat and humidity of the Deep South time and time again, and is collecting all of this data, sweating, exposing themselves to chiggers and ticks and everything else. I mean, this guy is the real deal. And as a farmer, as a rancher, I have to say I tremendously appreciate that, because, he was out there working hard to collect this data. And that, to me, as a former academic, that's the biggest compliment I can give to an academic.
Oh, I really appreciate it, Alan. And yeah, no, I mean, I think likewise. Thank you for the amazing work that you guys do, and you do with understanding ag, and just on a personal note, in working with people on the ground and actually making these changes. And I do what I didn't tell you, Alan, is that I actually quite enjoy working out in the heat and the sun. So it wasn't a burden at all. It was actually quite enjoyable. I always like, the best days are always out in the field. So
very good, Dr. Van Vliet, Dr. Williams. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Clay.
Very good stuff there. Really appreciate their perspective. And again, similar to with Aaron Berger, just the research-based perspective, not just flying off the handle and saying, this is what I read in some dark corner of the internet, as I said earlier in this episode, but just really, these are the things that we can verify really accurately in these regards, and so appreciate both of them taking the time to come out and share that with us. Very much looking forward to next week on the Working Cows podcast. We're going to talk to Harry Cope from Missouri, Central Missouri. We're going to talk to him about his winter feeding strategy. Very interesting episode. Timely. No, we're not winter feeding right now, but this is an opportunity, I think, to look at some of those options for planting something that still has some time to grow between now and when you would be feeding winter in the winter, and some of the things that he's doing with grazing, standing milo, and some of those things. So looking forward to that coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.